Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Hello. Hello, everyone. For those that do not know me, I'm Heidi Studebaker, co-chair of the Dune Acres Centennial Committee, and I am pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Ken Schoon. Known to many of us as an environmental advocate, chronicler and speaker of our dunes. His regional geology and history books can be found in our homes and in our personal libraries. Ken is a retired IU Northwest science professor, founding board member of the Dunes Learning Center, and current member of the Munster Town Council. Ken and his books are available here today for purchase and signing. So please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Kenneth Schoon on his very first visit to the Dune Acres Clubhouse.
Always got a little frightened with applause before I talk because it sets the bar high. It tells me you're expecting me to be great, and so we'll see. But anyway, I would like to talk about my favorite subject, which I think is the Indiana Dunes. And I'd like to start with what other people thought of the dunes in times past. Anybody here ever been to Tipton, Indiana? Okay, a few people. It was named for this man, John Tipton, who was an Indiana pioneer, founded the city of Columbus, helped establish Indianapolis, and by the way, after founding the city of Columbus, he was very upset that the people living there didn't name it after him. They named it after Christopher Columbus instead. He helped establish Indianapolis. However, they did then name the town of Tipton after him, so he did get an Indiana town. He chaired the Indiana Committee on Roads and Canals and helped set the Indiana-Illinois boundary, which meant that he had to travel from Vincennes all the way up to Lake Michigan. So he said this about the dunes: "These ponds and marshes and sandhills can never admit of settlement, nor never will be of much service to our state." 1821. No settlement, right? The Chesterton Tribune, you've probably heard of, maybe read, maybe subscribed to the Chesterton Tribune. In 1890, they wrote, without one bit of exaggeration, "The Dune Country is the most godforsaken place in the state of Indiana. In the midst of sandhills, swamps, and sloughs, its headquarters for malaria, sandburrs, and bullfrogs." Think of that. Malaria and bullfrogs being in the same level in his last sentence. You know, both objectionable. Then there's Henry Chandler Coles, just a few years later, in 1890, who was, at this point, a graduate student at the University of Chicago. And he fell in love with the dunes, as he noticed the dunes are a common meeting ground of trees and wildflowers from all directions. One of the first people to say something positive about this part of the state. And then, a few years after that, 7 years after that, the Indiana State geologist, who you may not have heard of, William Blatchley, wrote that there's no better place for an extended botanical study of a limited area of the state than among the dunes, swamps, peat bogs, prairies, and river bottoms of this area. Short period of time, a lot of difference in what this area could offer. Why the difference? Why is it a common meeting ground of places? Well, the answer to the question can be found in my two favorite subjects, which are geology and geography. And so starting with geography, if you think of Northwest Indiana and you headed west, well, let's do it the other way. If you started in Northwest Indiana and headed east, if you went through area that had not been developed, it would most likely today be forested. Most of Indiana was forested, so was almost everything to the east. Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, New England, it was all forests. But that isn't true if you head west. After all, Illinois is the prairie state. And if you think of South Dakota and Nebraska and Iowa before settlement, it wasn't forested, it was prairie. You may have remembered in school learning that people built houses out of sod because there weren't any trees to build the houses. So one of the reasons the dunes are fairly important nationally is because we're at sort of the dividing place between the forest lands to the east and the grasslands to the west. Lake and Porter County are kind of interesting. They're neither one or the other, but they're both. So there are some areas that are forested and some areas that were prairie, pretty close to each other. So what geologists got to come up with a name. And so they came up with a real simple name, the Central Forest Grasslands Transition Ecoregion. But that's not all. Now, that transition ecoregion could be anywhere in Indiana or Terre Haute or Kentucky or anywhere, you know, between the east and the west. But what makes the dunes interesting is there are two other areas, the Arctic to the north and the desert to the south. And we have plants from all four. We have Arctic plants like the tamarack tree or the larch if you watch Monty Python. And we have the prickly pear cactus, which grows in American deserts. It doesn't grow any further north in the dunes, but it does grow in the dunes area. And we have trees that are from the forests, and we have trees from prairies. And there's only one place where all four of those intersect, and that's right about the southern tip of Lake Michigan, the Indiana Dunes region. So now geologically, there is a big difference as well. Some of you picked up a copy of Calumet Beginnings, which was the first book that I had done about this area. And several of our features in the dunes area were made by glaciers. The most important being the Valparaiso Moraine, which is a hilly area well to the southeast of here, goes through the city of Valparaiso, as you might guess. And north of that is the Tinley Moraine, and then the Lake Border Moraine, also formed by the glacier. But then the rest of it was formed by various times of Lake Michigan, which I won't go into much. But there's the Glenwood shoreline and the Calumet shoreline. Route 12 is basically in this area the Calumet shorelines. There used to be sand dunes on the south side of Route 12, but those have been cleared in order to make room for commercial development and things of that sort. And then the Tolleson shoreline next to the lake. And the point here is that the older landscapes are further away from the lake. So as you move from the Valparaiso Moraine and move towards the lake, you get to younger and younger landscapes. The Valparaiso Moraine is 20,000 years old, and the Tolleson shoreline is anywhere within the last 2,000 or 3,000 years. Some of the dunes, some of the ridges are less than 20 years old. If you have listened to some of the complaints of your neighbors in north of Michigan City, in Long Beach, for instance, they're very upset about the dunes that are growing today between their houses and Lake Michigan. So Duneland has different ecosystems because we have former lake bottom, as you can see, and there's water and hills and moraines. There are different ages, which I just explained, different soils in each of those different areas. And in addition, the dunes has an unusual beauty, but that, of course, is beauty is in the eye of the beholder. It wasn't unusual beauty to Mr. Tipton. And inspiring history, which I think you'll agree with if you don't know much about the history of the area by the time I sit down. Okay, we also have a lot of different kinds of landscapes in the dunes because of those different shorelines and moraines and things of that sort. We have, of course, dunes. We have the four dunes, which we're sitting on right now. Well, you're sitting, I'm not. And the beach. And there are blowouts. If you've done much hiking around the dunes, you've probably run across some of our blowouts. Blowouts are funny because are a sandy desert but surrounded by lush vegetation. And then we have forests, of course. We do have prairies. We have wetlands. We have savannas. Most people really haven't heard of what a savanna is or couldn't tell me, but it's sort of halfway between a forest and a prairie. It's wooded like this, but the trees are far enough apart that sunlight can hit the ground, and therefore you can get some prairie plants that grow on the ground, but you still have the trees that aren't common to prairies. Dune and swale, which is a term that I'm going to start some kind of campaign to get people to change the term. It really should be called a dune ridge and swale, or just ridge and swale topography. Because I've taken people through hikes at Gibson Woods and at Miller Woods, and when we're done, people say, where are the dunes? I said, you've been walking on them, but they're not dunes, they're ridges. But the name of the area is called dune and swale. And I'm guilty of using that term too. But we need to change that. Landscape diversity is then common in this area, but there's also biodiversity in this area. Our National Lakeshore has more than 1,200 different species of ferns and flowering plants, including 28 different species of orchids. You know how many different species of orchids Hawaii has? 3.
Oh my God. Wow.
Now, admittedly, some of our orchids are pretty tiny. You wouldn't give them to your girlfriend, you know, for the prom. We have 600 species of fungus. I bet you didn't know that. Bet you didn't care either. 46 species of mammals, the largest being the white-tailed deer. 18 amphibians, 22 reptiles, 60 different kinds of butterflies, 71 kinds of fish, and a whopping 350 species of birds. The reason for the large number of birds is because they don't all live here at the same time. They migrate. You know, so if you've ever seen it and it's natural and it wasn't somebody who brought it in and let it go, then it gets counted. Our National Lakeshore is one of the most biologically diverse national parks in the entire country. And I shouldn't have used the word lakeshore. That should have been uncapitalized L. We have more different kinds of species here than almost any of the famous national parks. More than Yellowstone, more than the redwood forests, more than Arcadia, more than Yosemite, all in a fairly small national park. And beauty? I think so. Captured by hundreds of artists and photographers. In fact, I've already been told today about photos that you have of the dunes and of the beach. The most famous painter, of course, was Frank Dudley, who did a number of paintings. And he was painting before the days of color photographs. Yeah, you had color postcards, and you could paint a black and white photo, as many people did. But with his paintings, you could actually see the dunes in color. And that was his home, his studio in the dunes. And he passed away in 1957. And the house is no longer there. An inspiring history. How far back does our history go? Well, the first many thousand years we don't know much about, when the Native Americans lived in this area. We know the Miami tribe was here. We know the Potawatomi were here. And because they didn't have written records, our written history begins with the French connections. We don't know who the first French or the first Europeans who were in this area. Probably Frenchmen who came in canoes trying to find mink and muskrat and pelts that they could then take to Montreal or to Quebec City and sell to Europeans who wanted those beaver skins and things of that sort. But the first written records were made when Jacques Marquette came into this area in 1675. On his way home, he passed through the Calumet region. He passed right in front of where this building is today. There's a park named for him in Miller, the Marquette Park, and Father Marquette greets all visitors to the park when they arrive, but that's not how Marquette felt when he was here. It was at the end of the trip. He was extremely sick. He was heading home instead of going further south because his illness was so debilitating that he was in one canoe and his companions had to lift him out and set him on the ground. But it's very likely that, considering how many miles he traveled each day, that he probably stopped at the mouth of the Calumet River in Miller, at the mouth of Fort Creek or Dunes Creek here in Porter County, and at the mouth of Trail Creek. And if you talk to people from Michigan City, they'll tell you not only did he stop there, but he gave names to some of the features, including a spring, which is still called Marquette Spring, and the Council Grove, and things of that sort. And He blessed the spring, and he did all kinds of things. Must have been very difficult having people carrying him everywhere he was going. But I said that probably might not be true, and I haven't been invited to Michigan City since. But the Cours de Bois, which means runners of the woods, came in this area after Marquette, and they got licenses from the French government to trap. Well, they couldn't trap enough, so they made deals with the Indians. You trap, sell them to us, and we'll give you money, or we'll trade and give you things that you might want. And this country's basically ignored the fur traders, the French who came in this area. Canada has not. The back of its quarter has a canoe with a Cours de Bois canoe guys inside, but American history is pretty much forgotten that part. What we haven't forgotten, at least people who have lived much in this area, is that Le Petit Fort was very close to where we are today. It was built by the French. Looks like a stockade. That photograph, by the way, is not of Indiana. I borrowed that photograph from Fort Duquesne, Pennsylvania, because it's about the same size and about the same age, except this is a reconstruction, as Le Petit Fort was. But notice it's called a fort, which implies that it's military. It wasn't military. It was, the stockade was built not to keep the Indians out or the British out. It was meant to keep the deer out. Because they would have gardens inside, and they would plant vegetables, bringing seeds with them, and they didn't like the idea of deer eating all of their vegetables. The French and Indian War was in 1754. It's the war in the United States history books that gets the shortest shrift, and most kids today couldn't tell you anything about it, except it probably had something to do with the French or the Indians. And it did, and it was basically the French versus the British, and George Washington fought for the British. That's where he got his experience in military operations, was fighting for King George. But the British did win, and the French left. So they took their priests, they took their missionaries, they took their soldiers, and left this area. And the French flag was taken down, and the Union Jack was put up. There was a fort that the French did build, a real fort, and that was near St. Joseph, Michigan, which isn't far north of the Michigan-Indiana border. His archaeologists in that area have found exactly where the fort was, and there's been talk about rebuilding it as a tourist destination. That talk is 15 years old, and as far as I know, they haven't done anything with it yet. The first person who lived in northwest Indiana who wasn't an Indian, whose name we know, was Jean-Baptiste Pointe de Sable. He had a trading post. Now, if you have an old Cook County history book, an old book, 100 years old or more, they will say that his trading post was in Cook County at the mouth of the Chicago River. Wrong. If they read any of the original documents, they'll talk about people in the Chicago area or on the Illinois side of the river crossing the lake to get to DeSable's trading post. It was very close to where the International Friendship Gardens are now, east of Michigan City. That's about where his trading post was, and from his records, it was on top of a dune. Well, you know that the dunes move, and he would have built it out of wood, and wood rots. And people have gone looking for things and not finding any physical evidence of it. But his first trading post was here. He was captured by the British, even though he was a loyal subject, he said, of King George during the Revolutionary War, and taken up to Canada. After the war, he came down here and settled on the other side of the lake at the mouth of the Chicago River and established a town in that area, eventually leaving, and he was buried someplace, I think in Missouri or somewhere east of here. He wasn't called DuSable until after he died. I don't know why the historians started spelling it that way instead of Point de Sable, which means point of sand. In other words, where he was from was probably a peninsula into Lake Michigan or maybe Lake Huron or someplace else. But anyway, we do have Revolutionary War connections right here along the lakeshore. In 1780, there was a very important year. A very important Virginian during the Revolutionary War, that's 4 years after the Declaration of Independence, and the British were holding a fort in Vincennes, and a fellow whose name is George Rogers Clark, whose brother was the Clark that went with Lewis and out west years later. But George Rogers Clark defeated the British at a battle there and became a hero. George Rogers Clark High School was named for him, and down in the Vincennes area you'll see a monument for him. Bunch of American sympathizers up here thought, wow, if he could defeat the British, we could go up to Fort St. Joseph and capture it. So a bunch of them headed north. I don't think they carried the American flag, but might be what they would have if they had. And they went into the fort, and good grief, when they got there, the doors were open and the fort was undefended because it was wintertime and the British were out hunting. Not expecting an army coming towards them. It wasn't really an army. These guys spent the night. They saw all these pelts that the Indians had brought in. They brought pack horses with them. They loaded their mules and pack horses up, and they headed back west. The British got back from their hunt, and somebody has been here. And so they have to look for, where were they? Well, it had to be some time ago because the fire was cold. But nevertheless, they headed off. Excuse me, I'm ahead of myself. It wasn't very long ago because the fire wasn't cold. And so they headed off and they caught up with the Americans, and there was a battle, and they fought, and the British won. Maybe that's why it's not in our Indiana history books. Now, where was the battle? Well, they knew it was near the mouth of the creek. Which creek? If you live in Michigan City, you will swear that it was called the Battle of Trail Creek. And December 5th, 1780, in the aftermath of George Rogers Clark's victory, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And if you ever want to make a bet with somebody, anybody ever hear of a famous person, now famous, called Tom Brady? Yeah, you've heard of Tom Brady. He was a patriot. He's very, well, he was, right? I'm not making this up. He was. Tom Brady took part in stuff here in Northwest Indiana. And Tom Brady was actually here when the British came and caught up with the Americans. Read the historical marker. It'll say Lieutenant Thomas Brady was here, and he was, of course, a patriot, fighting for the United States. But other reports say that the battle took place at Le Petit Fort, which would have been at Dunes Creek, which they named Fort Creek. And same day, same people, same everything. Two different historical markers. I'm in Porter County now, so of course I believe the other one. And the reason why there are two is because there were two different versions of the report that were handed into the military officers. The British didn't treat the men that they captured as prisoners of war because none of them were members of an army. They didn't have any papers. They hadn't sworn allegiance to the new country, and so they treated them as thieves. You stole our pelts, we want them back. Well, so the British won. Well, a few weeks later, the conquistadors in St. Louis, Missouri, on the west side of the Mississippi River, thought if a ragtag group of American patriots could capture that fort, we can too. And so a whole group of Spanish soldiers headed up the Mississippi and the Illinois River and traipsed right in front of, which way's the lake? That way, traipsed in front of where this building is now and got to the fort, and they were ready for battle. The British were not expecting them, so they left the place unprotected and they were out hunting. And I wouldn't make this up. So the Spanish went in. They weren't interested in pelts and stuff like that. Besides, it was too far to carry that stuff all the way back to St. Louis. What they did was steal the flag and put the Spanish flag up, spent the night, ate the food that was there, and then left the next morning. And by the time the British got back from their hunt, they realized somebody had been here. But that time the fire was cold and they did not give chase. So come on. And here's the Spanish heading back, right again, passing in front of this building, which wasn't here yet. And of course, the war ended soon after that, and the Treaty of Paris, Britain decided to give the land to the new United States, this land that is now Indiana and Illinois and Michigan and Wisconsin. It wasn't a foregone conclusion. The Spanish showed up at the peace treaty talks because they captured the fort. Therefore, this area should have been Spanish. Nobody paid much attention to them. But of course, the British kind of wanted to keep it because they still had Canada, and the United States wanted it, and because of George Rogers Clark's victory, and eventually became part of the United States, called the Northwest Territory. And in 1800, it was named the Indiana Territory. In 1805, they created the northern half of the Indiana Territory becomes the Michigan Territory. And the boundary is the southern tip of Lake Michigan, where Indian Boundary Road is today. Everything north of that line, including this building and all of Dune Acres and Ogden Dunes and Miller, not all of Miller, but Michigan City, was in Michigan, in the Michigan Territory, and remained that way until Indiana became a state. And when Indiana was writing its constitution, it just declared that the northern boundary is 10 miles north of the southern tip of Lake Michigan, and so the boundary was moved north. Well, 2 years later, Illinois is appealing for statehood, and they figured if Indiana could do it, they could do it, but instead of going just 10 miles, they went 60 miles north of the southern tip of Lake Michigan. Wisconsin didn't like that, so, Michigan didn't like that because, they're losing money, land. Wisconsin was losing land. Michigan actually got compensated by being given the northern part of Wisconsin, which we now call the Upper Peninsula. And all of that was because Indiana wanted lake frontage. Considering that the having frontage on the lake would be valuable. So here we have Indiana in 1816, but nobody lived here yet, except the Native Americans. In 1822, I'm sure you know this part of the story, so when Joseph Bailey came south. Again, this was the United States. The official language of the United States is English. Joseph Bailey was from French Canada. He didn't spell his name the same way Baileys do around here. And he was French speaking, and he had an Indian wife. And he built a trading post. And one of the amazing things is the first permanent houses built by European settlers still stand at the Bailey homestead. Well, then people started moving into this area, coming up from the south, and Michigan City became a city in 1833, Bailey Town the next year, Indiana City and City West in 1836, which was just 2 years later. Of those, the only one that's actually survived was Michigan City. And the reason it survived, there were several dream cities that were called, we have dreams, this is going to be a big city someday. The only one that actually fulfilled that dream was Michigan City. And that was because of Senator Daniel Webster, who came through this area representing Congress. And City West wanted the port built here. And Michigan City people wanted the port built here. And when he got back to Washington, D.C., he said, it's going to be in Michigan City. And they got the port. And therefore, that city grew with the other dream cities, went the way of my dreams when I wake up in the morning. So Michigan City got a lighthouse that still stands, and lots of other things. This is the riverfront. That's Lake Michigan in the background, and Trail Creek coming up that way. Newtown, New Street. This is the business district on Franklin Street, and the whole street is wood. It lasted about 7 years. And then some color postcards from the early days. And Michigan City became a heavily industrial area as well. Few people realized that Michigan City had the Barker plant that made railroad cars. They were the largest maker of freight cars for railroads in the United States. And they kept that until they were purchased by Pullman. Other early industries were sawmills and grist mills. Remember, we had lots of forests, and the forests would cut the lumber so that we could have lumber to build houses with. And grist mills meant you could bring your crops, and they could grind them and make flour out of grind. Oh, and fishing. Fishing started out being very small. It became big business. And Porter Beach has one of the earliest fish houses still standing at the north end of the street. And in 1850, our pioneer days basically ended because that's when the railroads came in from the East Coast. And the first railroad was the Michigan Central. That's the Michigan City Depot behind it. And the Michigan City, because it was, the Michigan Central started, as you could guess, from Michigan, coming south this way, coming south and west this way, and it entered the state of Indiana at Michigan City, where you saw that picture. The Michigan Southern and Northern Indiana Railroad came in a different route, but they basically were in a race to see who could get to Chicago first. And they crossed at Porter and then headed up north into the city. The Monon is the third earliest railroad that came into this area. And the Monon did not go to Chicago. It went to Michigan City because people were still thinking Michigan City is going to be the industrial hub of the central part of the United States. It'll have, the biggest port eventually. And they weren't thinking of Chicago's connection to the Mississippi River through what is now the Illinois and Michigan Canal. The Lincoln funeral train came through Michigan City because getting from Indianapolis, where the train was, to Chicago, where they had a scheduled funeral, and then down to Springfield for his burial, the only way to get to Chicago from Indianapolis was to take the Monon up to Michigan City. And so the Monon came up through Michigan City, and because there was a delay at Michigan City, there was actually a funeral held for Abraham Lincoln in the city with his body present. And this is the route that the train took. The funeral train then went along the Michigan Central, which at that point was only 15 years old, and got him into the city of Chicago. The most valuable mineral resource in the Calumet region in those early days was sand. And there was no major sand development, sand mining, until those railroads were here. Once the railroads were here, you could mine sand, put it on a railroad car, and haul it off to whoever wanted to pay for it. And other people in Indiana and Chicago wanted to pay for it. Those of you who have enjoyed times in Lincoln Park in Chicago, or Millennium Park, or Grant Park, or Jackson Park, you're walking on Indiana sand. when you're there. Clean Drift, this is an advertisement for sand being sold from Michigan City. Dune Park is not the park today. I mean, this was named before the national park was there. But what is here called Dune Park and their mining sand is now part of what became Bethlehem Steel and now is Cleveland Cliffs. The sand dune in Michigan City was the Hoosier Slide. Hoosier Slide lasted longer than a lot of the other sand dunes in the old days because there was an impurity in the sand. And the impurity in the sand meant you couldn't make clear glass. You couldn't do window glass out of it. And so everybody, all the sand mining companies, especially around Muncie and Kokomo and Gas City, ignored the Hoosier Slide and left it as a sand dune where you could have weddings at the top of it and things like that, until the folks at Ball Company realized that colored glass made what was inside last longer. And that's why beer comes in brown glasses, and Ball made a fortune selling sand. And anytime you see an old Ball jar that is bluish in color, that came from the only place they could get blue glass, and that was Michigan City's. And I contacted the company when I was doing a report on sand mining and asked, what is it that caused the blue color? We don't know. And another major mineral export from this area was ice. This is the days before refrigeration, and not Lake Michigan, but Long Lake and Wolf Lake and Hammond and Pine Lake and Stone Lake and LaPorte and places where the guys who mined sand in the summertime were usually hired by the same company to slice ice in the wintertime, store it, and then sell it to people through the spring.
Where would you store it?
I'm sorry?
Where would you store it?
Where was?
Store it.
Where would you store it?
Right along the edge of the shore, they built ice houses. And the ice houses had two exterior walls filled with sawdust, which of course was a waste product from the sawmills. And then they would stack the ice as thick as they could and then take from the top and put it on wagons and sell it through neighborhoods, hauling it into people's homes and putting it into their ice box. I remember the story of somebody's grandmother who thought, well, the ice melts too fast, so she wrapped it in a towel so that it would last longer, it'd be insulated. And everything in her refrigerator, actually everything in her ice box, molded. Because it's the process of melting that absorbs the heat from the other things and keeps the meat and other milk and things cold. So you have to let it melt. So anyway, 1869 saw more railroads come into the Dunes area. And one interesting fact is the Michigan Southern merged with a line out east and became the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern. And I remind myself by underlining that in red that in order to attract passengers, they would take a carpet that was red and roll it out in front of the car so that people coming in would walk along a red carpet to get inside, and then when they got off in Chicago or wherever they were going, the Lakeshore Railroad Company would lay that carpet out again. And the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railroad is the reason why red carpets are still used for your best guests at movie houses or wherever you want to have a red carpet. But there's a part of Duneland in that usage. Well, the B&O came through in 1874, and the B&O crossed the Michigan Southern at Miller Beach and created a grand crossing here in the Dunes country. The Wabash Railroad came a few years later in 1892. You'd think that there wasn't room for any more trains, but there were. But in 1885, the Porter County Duneland area was still pretty empty. None of those roads were, it's not a short drive, it's a longer walk from US 12 to the lake. I know, because I just drove it. And it seems to get longer every time I come to Dune Acres. Remember, John Tipton said these ponds, marshes, and sandhills can never be of service to our lake. Well, he was wrong. And in 1890, Mayor Krieger of Michigan City did what was then considered impossible thing of creating a park on the lakeshore. And in 1891, stockyards were actually platted north of the village of Porter. A little bit about each of those. This was the picture I showed you of the mouth of Trail Creek. When Michigan City was expecting to be the big port in the Midwest, people built warehouses and all kinds of stuff at the port along the lakeshore out of wood, because that was the only building material here. And then Chicago took all that business away from Michigan City. So the businesses went bankrupt, and the buildings sat derelict and falling apart and rotting. And Martin Krieger was elected mayor of Michigan City, and of course nobody liked that. And you had to cross. I mean, the city, Michigan City was over here. So you had actually, before you would get to that, you'd have to build a bridge. And he actually got permission from the state of Indiana to purchase property to become a park. That wasn't legal in Indiana until then. So in a way, Washington Park was Indiana's first park. And the statue is dedicated to soldiers of the Civil War, and I think the Spanish-American War. And anybody ever been to the amusement park that used to be here at Washington? Okay, not too many people. But anyway, there's a roller coaster and all kinds of fun things were built at Washington Park. And excursion boats started bringing people from Chicago by water to Michigan City. And the excursion trains would bring trains of tourists from Fort Wayne and points east to Michigan City, or from Indianapolis and Louisville up to Michigan City to take advantage of this wonderful park. And I don't have it in front of me. The Eastland, the boat that capsized in the Chicago River, was going to come to Michigan City. It was the people that were on it and the people who lost their lives got on the boat expecting that they were going to go to Washington Park and have a wonderful afternoon. It was also, notice the Michigan Central Railroad isn't all that close to the dunes. Not terribly close to the lakeshore. And a bunch of people, and I don't know who they were, never did find out and haven't looked really, decided this was a place they could make some money. The year was 1891, and the city of Chicago was getting all excited because they were planning a World's Fair that was to open in 1892 or 1893. It was the World's Columbian Exhibition. And so a bunch of people bought some land in northern Porter County. They legally subdivided it into 1,500 lots using the same size lot that the city of Chicago had, which was 25 feet wide. I mean, my wife's grandmother lived in a duplex in Chicago, and the lot was 25 feet wide. And they named the streets Michigan, Wabash, State Street, and Dearborn. Oh my gosh. And they named the avenues starting with 127th, 28th, 29th, and 30th. And they sold lots to Chicagoans. No, Chicagoans, no, this isn't in Chicago. They sold lots to visitors at the fair who wanted to buy some Chicago property. Oh. They were told this is in Indiana, but you know, they could see the names. You want to buy a house and it's at the corner of 127th in Michigan, or a corner of 130th in Dearborn. And of course, you can't read it very well, but right up here, what would they name that street? The diagonal one? Lake Shore Drive. And this was all legal. They sold every single lot. What do you do with those lots? There's no street to get there. There were no streets. I mean, there are streets on a piece of paper, but not on the ground. And so you own a 25-foot section someplace in this massive sand, and you have no idea where your property is. And so people kind of thought, I got gypped. I shouldn't have done that. I lost some money. Until their tax bills arrived, because they owned property in Porter County, so they had to pay property taxes. And most people just refused to pay the tax, and so the land reverted back to the county government. And other people chose to buy their neighbors' lots and ended up selling them 50 years later and making quite a bit of money. Those street names are still there. Wabash, State, Dearborn, and LaSalle are still in Porter Beach, Indiana. But the east-west streets, they got rid of the numbers 127th and 128th. So you have Bohe Drive, and you have Duneland Drive, and you have, I think that's Roxon Drive, something like that. So Porter Beach is still today built on that grid system, not like Dune Acres. You know, when I was talking to Heidi on the phone, how do I get here? You know, the streets, if there is one thing that does not describe the streets in Dune Acres, it's a grid system. But Porter Beach is still a grid system. Once those lots were surveyed and sold, they had no way, except if you wanted to re-subdivide, you'd have to buy every single lot and then petition for re-subdivision, and they didn't. But notice the number of the streets aren't through streets, because there's sand dunes there. And of course, the empty beach was also a great place to learn how to fly. And the most famous flyer in those early days was Octave Chanute, who was a mechanic, fascinated with heavier-than-air transportation. And he had published a book entitled Progress in Flying Machines that you can still buy on the web. It's still for sale. And he was, in order to write a book about progress, he had to talk to people who were making gliders and trying to figure, what he wanted to do is get one of everything and take them to the dunes and practice and see which ones are best. And so he came out in 1896 twice, once in June and once in August. In June, he went to Miller Station. Then he came back to take the ones that did the best at Miller. And we don't exactly know where he did his second bunch of testing. But it was farther away from civilization because he didn't want the newspapers around. But he did have his own photographer. And so he did some rather remarkable work. And then just a few years later, he went to Kitty Hawk and advised the Wright brothers on designing a biplane and putting an engine on it and propellers and getting it to move. And that's why there is today the old bathhouse at Miller Beach that used to be called a bathhouse. I changed clothes when I was a kid in that building, and now it's a museum. And it's called the Aquatorium. And it is owned by, this is the name of the organization, the Society for the Restoration of the Gary Bathing Beach Aquatorium and Octave Chanute's Place in History. It's also a conference center today. So one last railroad to come through. And you know what that one is? I'm putting it in blue because it's the electric one. And that was the South Shore. Oh, single track, of course. Coming out this way. And that was 1908, and that meant that Chicagoans could easily get to the dunes. And that's when the South Shore posters started being popular. Anybody here ever ride in one of these old South Shore cars? You know, they had a divider down the middle, smoking on one side and no smoking on the other. And notice it never said smoke on one side and no smoke on the other. You couldn't light a cigarette on the no smoking side, but smokes tended to get there anyway. And they were, of course, replaced by the newer cars. And the Dunes was also a place where a lot of, we would say Hollywood movies, but there wasn't Hollywood yet. Chicago movies were shot. The S&A film studio predated anything in Hollywood. And here is the second Spanish invasion of the Dunes. This is the movie called The Conquest of Mexico, where the conquistadors are landing on the North American continent at the north end of Lake Street. Unfortunately, our weather wasn't good enough, and winter made it difficult to do outdoor filming, and so the industry basically moved to Southern California. But it started here. Because the dunes were sort of still empty, it was a place to get away from it all, and probably the most famous resident was Alice Gray, and her name isn't famous. The name that she was called, Diana of the Dunes, was. And she wasn't poor. Her father was a doctor. She was a graduate of the University of Chicago. She was unhappy with the lifestyle in Chicago, and she came out here to live and just stayed. What time do I need to be done?
Oh, you're fine. We were planning maybe another like 10 minutes of the talk.
Okay.
And then questions.
Okay.
But just think how that works for you.
Alrighty. Place to enjoy the sun. Tourists started coming there, particularly on the 4th of July and Memorial Day and things like that. And this is Carr's Beach, which was in Miller Beach, 1917 on the 4th of July. Notice that they're dancing on wood. Because still there was no air conditioning, one of the coolest places to dance in the summertime was outdoors. And by building a dancing platform on the beach, you could actually do a two-step or a four-step or a tango or a rumba or something of that sort on the beach. And the cool wind from the beach, from the lake, would make the area more comfortable than anything inside. But there were people unhappy with progress, and they wanted to save the dunes, and therefore you are probably familiar with the pageant that took place here by the Dunes organization, entitled The Dunes Under Four Flags. Why four flags? I'm not sure if I can remember them all, but it was the Potawatomi, the British, the French. No, it was the British, the French, the Spanish, and the American flags. You remember, that's why I had to show you the pictures of the Spanish coming ashore at Lake. No, it was actually because of the earlier trip when the Spanish were actually here. And they did a pageant to raise money to buy the property and convince Congress to create a national park. But World War I, this is what the national park was supposed to do. Be everything from County Line Road to County Line Road. So all of Porter County would have been in the national park. What they got was a state park that only included that area, and that was in the 1920s. And the state park was too small from the very beginning. I mean, the cars jammed the parking lot and you couldn't get in. There were traffic backups on Route 49. So Duneland was becoming a desirable place to have fun and also a desirable place to live. But it was still hard to get here. And so the first thing the state did was build the Dunes Highway, which was in 1922. And that's basically how I got here today, which was Route 12. And it follows, you know, you can see it following that amber line. It follows the Calumet shoreline. It was a beach, therefore it was flat and pretty straight. No dunes to cross. And then in 1926, the Burns Ditch, which is now, I saw the Burns Waterway because ditch is not a classy enough term to use, connected. And actually the reason it was dug was to create more farmland along the Little Calumet River. And then East Miller, Ogden Dunes, Midwest Steel, Consumers Company, Dune Acres, Porter Beach, Beverly Shores, NIPSCO's property, Long Beach, all came within a short amount of time. And of course, the most important of these is Dune Acres. 1923, and Dune Acres, I think, is the only one had this unique idea of building log houses. I was going to say log cabins because that flows, in my background. But of course, and these were not logs that were trees in this area. I think they all came from Oregon, and so many of the houses were built and still stand. I mean, it's a durable material. And of course, I couldn't come here without this picture. It may have been my first day, Heidi, that I've been in it, but it's not the first day I've known about it. Then in the 1930s, what the lakeshore still didn't have, and we're getting close to the end, is a public porch. It was established in 1988. 1998, every time I showed these slides, I would have the total number of kids who came here, and I finally lost count. I stopped counting at 100,000, and that was a while back. So Duneland has different ecosystems, different ages, different soils, unusual beauty, and an inspiring history. And what I'd like to do is end my presentation with my mouth shut. And one of those votes belongs to somebody here?
Rob Carson.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Questions?
Do we have questions? And then feel free to have some treats.
It's slightly different from the first edition. I have both because I wasn't sold out of the first when the second came. And there's a slight price difference, $30 for the older book. But I know some people knew that some of the pictures were replaced, and if it's a picture that you preferred in the older book, it's still here, it's still available. I also have a book about the Swedish settlements in this area, and I do need to mention that there's a picture of Heidi in that book as a teenager when she was the Lucia Queen of the Schellberg family farm. And some of you may know her connection with the Schellberg family. So I just had to mention that. I don't mention that to every audience that I go to. And the oldest book I have there is Calumet Beginnings, which I did 20 years ago. It's now in its 7th printing. And it was the only book that as I was working on it, I was worried what would happen to the book if I were to be in an automobile accident and get killed before it was finished. You know, I was worried. You know, I felt this is a book that has to be finished, that has to be out. I haven't felt that quite that way in other books since then, but that was the case. And I insisted that Indiana University Press have a color geologic map in the book. And it was actually in there twice as the end sheet in the front and the back. And then 20 years later, they want to do another edition of the book, and they didn't want to raise the price. So they changed, without asking, they changed the map to a black and white map, which I didn't like. So anybody who buys that book, if you email me and tell me you're interested, I will email you the color map. And you can then print it, fold it in half, and put it inside the book.
One question.
Yes.
You mentioned it's 350 different